Welcome to Plain Civics. Thank you for joining us. I'm Joe Ulery.
And I'm Bobbi Fisher.
Our goal is to break down how government works so you can make the government work for you. We're headed to talk about the Bill of Rights here in just a second, but first, Bobbi, it's the Fast Five, and today, you ask me.
The Fast Five.
Alrighty, number one, what is your favorite book of fiction?
Oh my gosh. I had her think really hard on that, Bobbi. You about blew up my brain because we're sitting in front of my actual bookcase right now, and you can see 99% of the books on there are nonfiction. So thankfully, I saw the book The Da Vinci Code, which reminded me that really after school, one of the first books that I sat down on a vacation and relaxed to read was Angels and Demons. And there was so much talk about the Da Vinci Code at that time that it made me think, I want to pick this book up and read it. So thank goodness I had at least one fiction book that I've read.
Well, those are both good ones.
Yeah.
And good movie, too. What is your favorite way to relax?
I like to go to the pool to relax. I only like to go with people to talk, so...
I can't imagine.
Yeah, just not having to think. Like, a lot of times my next door neighbors and I, we're really good friends, and we'll go over and learn how to play a new game, and laughing a lot is a good way for me to decompress.
That's what I like too. If you could live in a different era of time in American history, when would it be and why?
Knowing how I'm wired, I am always one who wants to speak up on behalf of those that aren't being treated right. So I think if I would be alive in the 50s and 60s, I would have been very active in the civil rights movement.
Very good. Glass half full or half empty?
Depends on the day. And what time
I can
of the
appreciate
day.
that.
Yeah. I want to strive to be a glass half full guy, but I think sometimes I'm a glass half empty. So like both.
I can relate. And finally, do you have a phobia?
I have a lot of phobias. One of my I hate spiders. Hate them. To the point where we basically are putting major chemicals down outside of our dog zones just because when we moved into this house, it had been open before they got the windows and so forth in, and I see a spider. I'm not like screaming like a 5-year-old girl, but once I see one, that I start thinking, all right, I'm going to go to bed. Is there going to be one in bed? And my mind starts to run. So spiders,
I can relate to that too.
Snakes, mice, I could go on and on. Was that number 5?
That was number 5.
Whew, okay, I made it through. That was a rough one for me today.
See, there were only a couple hard ones.
Yeah, you made me actually have to think on a couple of those today. All right, so that's Fast 5 today. Thank you for that. Now let's jump in and pick up the show.
And now our feature presentation.
So today we're going to talk about the Bill of Rights, and when it's capitalized, it's referring specifically to the first 10 amendments that were added to our Constitution as a package deal in 1791. And I say that because since then, each of the other 17 amendments that have been added separately. But this Bill of Rights was added as an agreement to get a couple of the states to ratify, as we talked about before. It was felt that these were rights that needed to be sure to be guaranteed, so they separated them but added all 10 of them together. So if you see the word or the term Bill of Rights not capitalized, it should be talking about what that is in general, but if you see it capitalized, it should be a reference to the Bill of Rights added to our Constitution. So if you recall from a couple of episodes ago, a few of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention refused to sign the final version of the new Constitution because it did not have a Bill of Rights. And the biggest anti-federalist argument against ratifying the new Constitution during the ratification process was that it lacked a Bill of Rights. It wasn't their only complaint, but it was the one that they kind of sailed their ship on. And a lot of these men said after all their own state constitutions listed the rights that their state governments could not infringe upon, and the Declaration of Independence argued that the colonies were ending their relationship with the British government because it was infringing on their natural rights. The Revolutionary War was fought and won to guarantee that these rights of the people be restored and protected by the government, not violated by the government. In addition, the new Constitution and government was an experiment. It was a combination of governing ideas from the past and some new ideas created by some of the framers. And so some were worried that this experimental government would become too powerful, especially because of things like the Necessary and Proper Clause and the General Welfare Clause, which we talked about a couple episodes ago. In order to get the new Constitution ratified over the objections of the Anti-Federalists, it was agreed that once the new Constitution took effect and the first Congress met, one of their first orders of business would be to create a Bill of Rights. Several prominent political figures of the time, including Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, argued for a Bill of Rights. Jefferson, who was on assignment in France at the time, I believe, wrote to James Madison expressing his concern over, and this is a quote, omission of a Bill of Rights providing clearly for the freedom of religion, freedom of the press, protection against standing armies, and restrictions against monopolies, end of his quote. In his first inaugural address, President George Washington urged Congress to amend the Constitution to express the, quote, reverence for the characteristic rights of freemen and a regard for public harmony, end quote. Madison, during his campaign to be elected as a representative for Virginia in the first Congress under the new Constitution, promised to propose a Bill of Rights. Although Madison had argued during the Constitutional Convention, if you remember, that a Bill of Rights was not necessary because, quote, the government can only exert the powers specified by the Constitution, end quote, he came to realize the importance voters placed on these individual protections. Madison largely borrowed from the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was written primarily by George Mason in 1776, just a couple of months before the Declaration of Independence. Madison also drew from recommendations that arose from state ratifying conventions for the new Constitution. Madison does present a collection of 19 possible amendments to the new Congress on June 8, 1789. The House passed a joint resolution containing 17 amendments based on Madison's proposal. The Senate changed the joint resolution to consist of only 12 amendments. A joint House and Senate conference committee settled the remaining disagreements in September 1789. On October 2nd, 1789, President Washington sent copies of the 12 amendments adopted by Congress to the states. By December 15th, 1791, notice it took a little over 2 years, 3/4 of the states had ratified 10 of these 12 amendments, which are now known as the Bill of Rights, and they were added in 1791 to the existing Constitution.
I didn't realize that they had originally tried for 12.
Yeah.
That's just something that got lost on me in history.
Maybe I should post a link to what the original 12
Yeah.
were. More than half of the amendments in the Bill of Rights have their roots in the Magna Carta, which we briefly discussed in episode 12. The Magna Carta was an agreement written in 1215 that was an agreement between the English people and the King of England, which was meant to protect certain rights and freedoms of the people, and it took some of the power away from the king and gave more rights to the people. Over time, the Magna Carta became part of English common law through two other later documents, the English Petition of Right in 1628, and then what is actually known as the English Bill of Rights in 1689. Each of these defined basic rights such as, these should sound familiar, trial by jury, no taxation without consent, free elections, due process of law, and no cruel and unusual punishment. And I want to stop there for just a second and notice the no taxation without consent, which means without representation. And this was 1689, so this is before the colonists rebel, actually almost 80 years before the English really started infringing on the colonists' rights by taxing them without their consent. And remember, the colonists were English subjects. They should have been given the same rights as people that actually lived in England. So they were, by this Bill of Rights, they should have not been taxed without their consent.
Planted the seed for the Revolutionary War.
Just a little side note, that wasn't even in my notes, but just a little side note and reminder. By passing these two laws, the English Petition of Right and the English Bill of Rights, this further limited the power of the British government. Colonial leaders wrote the Declaration of Independence, and the colonies fought the Revolutionary War against the British because the king and the British government started violating the rights of the colonists, who were, as I said, British subjects, and so subject to the same protections as the people living in England, or they should have been anyway. Continuing to protect individual rights was very important to the citizens and leaders of the United States as they started their new experiment in governing. Also, state constitutions had included bills of rights as they were developed after the colonies gained their independence. Having these individual protections was something that the Americans just felt was normal, something they should have. After the Bill of Rights was written and ratified, keep in mind that the Bill of Rights actually applied only to the federal government, not to the states. Again, the states all had their own, most of them did. The Bill of Rights was a separate list of amendments. It is not woven into the text of the Constitution, although there are a few rights that are protected in the text of the Constitution. Regardless of this, the amendments have been successful in limiting government action and protecting the people's rights. These amendments guarantee essential rights and civil liberties, such as the right to free speech, the right to bear arms, as well as reserving rights to the people and the states. And we'll kind of expand on that in just a little bit. Keep in mind the Bill of Rights represents the first step that we, the people, took in amending the new Constitution in order to form a more perfect union. The original unamended Constitution was a remarkable achievement in establishing a revolutionary structure of government that put the power in the hands of the people. The Bill of Rights built on that foundation, protecting Americans' most cherished freedoms, especially freedoms of speech, press, religion, assembly, and due process of law, just to name a few. So what is included in the Bill of Rights? And I'm just going to go through what each of the 10 amendments says, and like I said earlier in this episode, we will break some or all of these down in future episodes, starting with what we believe are the most important ones. Of course, the First Amendment would be one of those. The First Amendment says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Kind of to break that last part down, meaning you can complain about something the government has done and ask them to change it, and it's perfectly lawful unless you get violent. But like all of these protest marches and stuff, perfectly fine and expected in a nation like ours with the First Amendment. Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Third Amendment, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. And we talked in an earlier episode about quartering of troops, and just as a reminder, especially if you haven't listened to all the episodes, quartering was a fancy way of saying, the British, for example, before the Revolutionary War, sent redcoats over here, and they were the American colonists were expected to allow these soldiers, if they requested, to give them a place to stay in their home or their barn or their property, whatever the case may be. So quartering, if you think about it, your house is your quarters. Mm-hmm. So that's where the word comes from. So the Third Amendment is supposed to prevent that from ever happening again. Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So there should be a couple of familiar phrases there: unreasonable search and seizure and probable cause. And again, we'll come back to these later and explain them in more detail. Fifth Amendment, another one of the biggies. Mm-hmm. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy. That's the double jeopardy. Yep. You can't be prosecuted twice for the same offense. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. So due process of law, when we hear people talk about eminent domain, The government can take your property, but they have to give you just compensation for it.
Right.
Sixth Amendment. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. So there's a lot of the trial stuff there. You have a right to a speedy trial, impartial jury, know who's witnessing against you, what are you accused of, and have defense counsel.
One thing that pops to mind, the Delphi murders case was a global story, and there was always this talk of, well, there's no way he can be tried in Carroll County. They ended up getting a special judge from outside the venue, the county where the crime occurred, but I always would say, no, he has to be tried in Carroll County because that's where the crime occurred. So that's one practical example of that in place.
Seventh Amendment. In suits at common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Eighth Amendment. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. So some very important items in the Eighth Amendment as well. Now the Ninth and Tenth are the least known, and we'll talk about why we're going to follow up with that. But the Ninth says the enumeration, and that just means a list, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And the 10th Amendment says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So again, we're going to break down the 9th and 10th in just a minute and explain what they mean by that. Before we get there, though, there are generally considered to be three categories of rights. We have personal rights, we have economic rights, and we have political rights. Personal rights allow for individual autonomy or freedom in regard to things such as, for example, freedom of thought and conscience, privacy, movement. You can go wherever you want. The idea that humans are autonomous or self-governing individuals with fundamental rights is what the idea of natural rights is all about. And we've talked about natural rights numerous times. It is the idea that we possess these rights from birth and that the purpose of government is to protect these rights. Economic rights include things like choosing what work a person wants to do, acquiring and or disposing of property as desired, entering into contracts, creating and protecting intellectual property such as copyrights or patents, joining a labor union or a professional organization. Such rights as these can also be protected by both national and or state statutes. And then finally, political rights consist of the right for individuals to participate in voting and engaging in political activities of their choice. In other words, we should not be told who to vote for or whether we want to vote or if we want to attend a march or a rally or we want to sit at home and watch TV instead. Nobody's going to make us do those things associated with political rights. Also, in addition to those three categories, rights are also considered positive or negative, which in the context we're talking about here does not mean desirable or undesirable. As in positive would be desirable, negative, undesirable. That's not what we're talking about. Instead, they're referring to the relationship of individuals or classes or categories of individuals to their government. So positive rights require that the government act in specified ways, such as the rights of individuals to receive certain services from the government, such as protection, public education, food, housing, and medical care in some cases. The 6th and 7th Amendments require that the government to guarantee certain things to individuals in regard to the courts and the criminal system. And you might notice some of those things I mentioned, like public education and protection. Some of those are also things that national government or the federal government's not in charge of, but the state government is in charge of. Generally, when we think of protection, we generally think of our local or state police. However, the federal government also has protection. The FBI is protection. And when we think of public education, states generally govern public education, but the federal government has a Department of Education that also assists with that. We'll just call it that. So these are things that are meant to help people, and like food and housing and medical care in some cases, like people that need to be on things like Medicaid or Medicare. So those are positive things. And then negative rights are rights that restrict government action, such as many of the individual rights protected in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. For example, when the First Amendment states that, quote, Congress shall make no law, end quote, that violates fundamental rights to freedom of religion, press, speech, assembly, petition. So they can't do things that restrict those rights. So that's what a negative right is. That's what's meant by negative rights.
Got it.
Now, finally, let's go back to the 9th and 10th Amendment. The first 8 amendments establish specific guarantees of rights, but the 9th and 10th do not. The 9th Amendment has often been interpreted to mean that it would be impossible to list all the rights that should be protected from government interference. It confirms that the Bill of Rights does not increase the powers of the national government in areas not mentioned in the first 8 amendments. Also, and this is important, it does not guarantee any rights or impose any limitations on the national government. Rights are not absolute. Finally, it commands judges and Congress to affirm rights not mentioned in the Constitution. The fact that rights are not absolute is very important, and we'll talk more about it later, but when you hear people say things like, I can say that, I have freedom of speech. Well, maybe.
Yeah.
There are some cases where you may not have freedom of speech.
Right. We think of yelling fire in a
Right.
theater.
That's the famous case, yes. Or, I have the right to be out here protesting. Well, yeah, you did until you burned down that
Right.
business over there. So rights are not absolute. There may be, and often are, certain limitations. So, but like I said, we'll save delving into that deeply for a future episode. Finally, the 10th Amendment was one that the Anti-Federalists demanded in state ratifying conventions, as it states the nature of American federalism. And by federalism, we mean the fact that we have a national or federal government and we have state governments. And it protects the powers of the states against the national government. So certain things are specified as jobs of the federal government, and certain things are specified as jobs or powers of the state governments. And then something else comes along that they didn't think of. You know, there might have to be a discussion about who's in charge of that. But generally, we know these are the things that we expect the federal government to do. These are the things that the states can do, and the federal government cannot take those state jobs away. In concluding this episode, I will say that recent polling has shown that a high percentage of Americans know that the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights. And about 70% of Americans know that the First Amendment protects freedom of speech, but they don't really understand the true meaning of that protection. As I said just above, that, you know, it's not necessarily absolute. Only about 25% of Americans know that the First Amendment also protects freedom of religion, and only about 10% know that it also protects freedom of the press, assembly, and petition. So those are some pretty sad numbers.
Yeah.
That, you know, we live here and we don't even understand what our rights are and what's protected. So we have some work to do in educating the people better, and that's what we're trying to do with this podcast. And in future episodes, we will discuss individual amendments in more detail in order to provide more education in what these freedoms mean to us. We're out of time today, and we still haven't discussed slavery, so we will. That is definitely an important part of this time period and our history and our government. So we will get to slavery the next time, I promise.
Okay, and we will break down some of these amendments in more detail.
Exactly.
Because we ran down the list today to and be inclusive of all of the 10, but definitely there's more conversation there. So that brings us to the pop quiz. Bueller.
In last episode's question, it was what stops one branch of government from becoming too powerful? And I gave a hint. There are two things. If you said checks and balances, that's one. and separation of powers, that's 2. Those are your 2 things that keep the government from becoming too powerful.
Is that also the verbiage of co-equal powers?
Exactly. That's the whole idea behind checks and balances and separation of powers, is to keep one of the branches from becoming more powerful than the others.
Hopefully you got those right. If you've been listening to this podcast, what is our next question?
So the next question, this should be an easy one. Who is in charge of the executive branch?
That should be an easy one.
And you can give the name, but I really just mean in general, what do we call that person?
Right. What's the job?
What's the job title? Yes.
Right. Thank you for doing all the research on this. We've made it through another episode successfully, so Bobbi, thank you. And we hope that you'll join us again, but that's it for this episode of Plain Civics, breaking down the basics, no politics, just facts. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.
This is Plain Civics. Join us for the journey as we break down the basics of how government works so you can make the government work for you.